Hola, les damos la bienvenida a otro día de este encuentro de la comunidad de la imaginación, a Community of the Imagination. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Deseamos que sea un domingo muy especial. Verán que lo será gracias a el evento que tenemos hoy y que gira en torno a lo desconocido, también a lo conocido y a la imaginación a partir de lo que sabemos, pero también de lo que no sabemos. Voy a dejar a nuestra querida Magda Bogin, que es escritora y traductora, que vive en Nueva York y que además en Tepoztlán es la directora de nuestro programa Under the Volcano, que presente a nuestros invitados del día de hoy, que en verdad son un lujo. Bienvenida, Magda. Buenos días.
Gracias, Gaby. Welcome, everybody, and welcome back to our conversation from yesterday, which continues as part of our Community of the Imagination, a new way of bringing together writers and readers across boundaries of all sorts. So for those of you who were here yesterday, you will find great continuity. And for those just joining us for the first time today, we hope you stay with us as the series continues beyond today through the 3 Wednesdays of April. You should all have a single link that gets you into all of these events. And we just want to remind you of how the format is going to work for today's event. In general, we're asking people to keep their video and audio switched off so that we can spotlight the presenters. We'll bring you all back in at the end for a Q&A, which will be will flow in the chat. If you've never used a chat before on Zoom, you will click in the menu bar below at the bottom of your screen, in the middle, just to the left of a green button that says share screen. Don't try to share your screen, please, but you'll find the chat there, and you can send questions throughout the event that we will accumulate towards the end and hope to address. We leave a good amount of time at the end for your questions. I'm sure there will be some fascinating ones. What we're going to do, though, is start ourselves with questions, Gabi and I alternating, and our first presenter will be the astrophysicist, Priyamvada Natarajan, whom I'll present in just a moment. And she'll be followed by and joined by 3 novelists whom will present as their turn arrives. So I hope this is all clear. If you have technical issues, you can send them through the chat to the people listed at the top of your participant list. And I would say principally look for Hector Massin, who's running things behind, or Ricardo Morales. That is, if you have issues getting in or something is a little bit wonky, send a message to Hector or Ricardo through the chat, rather than certainly to me, because I will be focused on what's being said, and Gabi likewise. Okay, we're ready to go. So has everyone got their mics off, their video off? Gabi, I think you can put your mic on. We'll be speaking very soon. The first person, as I mentioned, that I want to introduce is Priyamvada Natarajan. And I'm going to give you a just tiny capsule about her because, as has been the case all along, our presenters' accomplishments would fill many screenfuls here. And I'm forced to reduce to just an essence, just as she will probably be forced to reduce her life's work on black holes and other matters, dark matters, to an essence in today's presentation. So Priyamvada Natarajan is originally from India. She's now based in Connecticut and teaches with a joint appointment in Astronomy and Physics at Yale University, which you know is in New Haven. Her research involves, and I have really culled this down, mapping the detailed distribution of dark matter in the universe, exploiting the bending of light en route to us from distant galaxies. Think of that. Personally, because I've been a fan of hers and tracking her through the cosmos, I encourage you to read her book, Mapping the Heavens, the Radical Scientific Ideas That Reveal the Cosmos. Her awards, honestly, believe me, are just too numerous to mention. Suffice it to say that Priyamvada Natarajan is a star. Welcome to Under the Volcano, and thank you so, so much for taking the time to share your work with a bunch of writers.
Thank you so much, Magda, for that very kind introduction. And I'm so delighted to be part of this festival. Of course, like everyone, I wish it was actually in Mexico. I would be there in a minute, but next time. So yeah, I am also really honored to be in conversation with some really fantastic writers on this panel later today.
Shall we jump in?
Yeah, so I thought we could jump in, and what I thought might be helpful is because of the kind of hold that black holes have on our imagination, I thought it might be useful to give you just a quick preview of scientifically what they are, why they are so bizarre, and why are we all preoccupied, from little kids onwards with black holes. So I would love to share my screen briefly and show you just a few slides. I mean, it's not meant to be, any kind of lecture or anything, just a sort of sketch of what is it about black holes. So the first thing that I realized when I was actually, I've been working on black holes for 20 odd years, but I did not realize that the word black hole, that phrase actually goes back to India. It's traced back to an infamous prison in Calcutta when the British East India Company, the local king actually captured some mercenaries from the British East India Company, and they died overnight. So it's referred to as the black hole of Calcutta. So, and this was well before astrophysics, had this idea of black holes or found them in the universe or anything. So conceptually, it was a place of no return. So it was an infamous prison, and you'll see how apt that title is. So there are three different ways in which, okay, black holes are quite complex, but they're simple too in an odd kind of way. And there are many different ways of thinking about them. So I'll give you three ways to think about them. Okay, so and pick whatever resonates with you, that you feel you got it. Okay, one is that they have an intense, there are regions in space where the strength of the pull of gravity is extremely intense. So a simple analogy, right, from the Earth. So the Earth has a pretty strong gravitational pull. That's why we are all anchored onto Earth. But remember, in order to hoist a rocket off to escape the gravitational grip of the Earth, we have to boost it, right? So you have these boosters, you've all seen these rocket launches. And so there's this thing called escape speed, the speed that you need to escape the grip of gravity. So for the Earth, that is 11.2 kilometers per second. It's quite a lot. We need rocket booster fuel to actually boost up, as you all know. Now imagine if that speed was actually the speed of light, which is huge. It's finite, but it's 186,000 kilometers per hour, right? So it's a very, very, I think I got the units wrong there, but anyway, I will ignore that for now because it's irrelevant. But at the speed of light is very, very large compared to any kind of conception we can have, and nothing material can be pushed out to that speed, right? Okay, the other way to think about black holes is the astrophysical way, is that they are the end states of stars. So very massive stars, after they have stopped glowing, and you all know they glow because of fusion reaction in their core. So this is nature has tapped fusion to give us this source of energy. The sun shines because of the fusion of hydrogen and helium atoms and so on. And so when a star exhausts its fuel, it can die in one of three ways. It leaves behind one of three corpses. One is a white dwarf, which is a very dim, cold star. The other is a neutron star. And the third possibility is a black hole. So you can think of a black hole also as sort of the nemesis of very massive stars end up as black holes. And they are real. So that's how they are real. That's why we go look for them. So they exist as objects in the universe that can be studied. Now, this is the coolest thing about black holes. And this is slightly more complicated and abstract. And this, of course, involves the reconceptualization of the universe as a four-dimensional sheet, and everything that has matter in the universe causes a little bit of a pothole in this sheet. You know, there's nothing above the sheet, nothing below the sheet. The entire universe is this sheet, and we cause a little, imperceptible dent. The Earth causes an imperceptible dent compared to other massive objects in the universe, like our galaxy, et cetera, et cetera. The black hole, so there's a little kind of cartoon that shows you what each kind of, what it does in terms of the depth of the pothole. A black hole is the kind of astrophysical object that causes a puncture in this fabric. It's a very deep pothole, okay? So, and so what that tells you is that there's something fundamental that black holes do to space and time. They distort space and time. The reason we are all fascinated with them is there's no other object in the universe that has this capacity to deform both space and time. And so the preoccupation with black holes is that there is a point, the reason it got called the black hole after the black hole of Calcutta, there is a region which is the point of no return. Not even light can be come back out once it crosses that. So this kind of sacred boundary is called the event horizon. So this is shown in this cartoon here. And then interestingly, there's also another place where light will be perennially trapped. So it's like Dante's, purgatory, right? So it's a limbo where you could be trapped forever. And that's the photon orbit or the light orbit that is shown as a circle. This is going to be relevant because I'll show you that we've kind of mapped the shadow of a black hole roughly out to there, like a real black hole in the universe, very recently. And it was an iconic image that you would have all seen. And this is this image. This is the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration that actually captured the light that is in that light orbit, that sort of region outside the event horizon, but skirting the event horizon. So this is as up close and personal to a black hole as we have gotten, okay? And this image is iconic. It was really technical feat and a feat of, data visualization, all kinds of firsts for this. And it was very clever because they had to use the entire Earth like a single radio dish. You've all seen these radio dishes. So they had to make something very clever with a network of radio telescopes dotted around the Earth to mimic the entire Earth as a dish collecting photons from. So what is a black hole? Where do you find them? It looks like almost every galaxy in the universe. So this is like a garden variety galaxy from the Hubble Space Telescope image. We can never quite see right into the heart because they are right at the heart of galaxies. So this is an artist visualization at this point. So what you see in red is all the gas that is being pulled in by the gravity of the black hole that is sitting right at that center. Okay, so we now believe that every galaxy, including our own in the universe, has a black hole. And the reason the subject is so rich to study, to give you one glimpse in one slide, is that the size of the black hole seems to scale. It's proportional to the size of the galaxy it's sitting in. So the more massive a galaxy, the brighter a galaxy, the bigger the black hole in the center. And to just give you a flavor for, so that's the big open question. Why is that? Why do galaxies know that they have a black hole? So this is a big open science question. So I just want to show you the work of one of my students, Angelo Ricarte, who has done this little kind of visual that shows you how we understand how black holes grow. And so what you see in the little dark dots at the end are the data from today. And what you saw, I'll run the movie one more time for you, is how you start from these little stars that you see are actually black holes. So, how they grow over time. The clock there is tracking time. So we are showing how, black holes will merge with each other, they'll crash and they'll grow, or they'll feed and they grow, and they eventually end up today where we find them. So this is the kind of storyline. So at some level, right, someone like me, I consider myself also building a cosmic storyline. But I have to satisfy observational constraints. So my storyline has to be circumscribed in some ways because it has to correspond to reality, what we measure, and I can then make predictions. And there is a lot of room for imagination. So, I also want to dispel one of these notions that a lot of people have, that science is not creative somehow. It's highly creative. It's no different from art. So I just wanted to share a couple of images now. One is this, wonderful sculpture that kind of tries to imagine what it must be like to skirt close to the event horizon. So this is Shea Hambri's a sculpture, which was inspired by a black hole. And then I'll stop here. And, in fiction, in graphic novels, everywhere, black holes are just, they really captivate our imagination. I mean, I am completely captivated, partly because they are, they represent the limits of what we can know and what is knowable. And therefore, they are places where we can leap off in imagination. So here is, Edgar Allan Poe, who is quite a remarkable imaginative genius. He has this idea of a maelstrom. It wasn't called the black hole then, but, this idea of a vortex and things getting siphoned in to the point of no return, right? This sort of oblivion that I don't know if many of you are fans of anime. I am. And this is Rumiko Takahashi's Inuyasha, where Miroku, the character, has a black hole in his hand, and so everything gets sucked in by the black hole. So the way in which black holes have permeated fiction, art, I mean, it's just really astounding. But I'm not surprised, given sort of how bizarre they really are.
Priya, what an extraordinary overview. Absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. Given this pull, both literally the physical pull of the black hole and the pull of the whole idea of black holes on the imagination of bystanders, as well as specialists like you who are looking at them, I imagine day after day, maybe night after night. The first question that I have really is, as you go closer and closer to knowing things, does the unknown seem to diminish, or do we simply generate further questions?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because I think in a way it encapsulates what is so seductive about science, right? The thing about science is that as you figure out, with the tools that we have, as you figure something out, there is a moment of understanding and clarity, but it always generates more questions. And that is what is so wonderful about the kind of, how science keeps our curiosity and scientific temper forces you to remain open-minded and curious, because every time you think you've sort of understood something, there's a deeper layer, there's a more profound understanding that you can get, and you have access. And especially with entities like black holes, you can't actually image them directly, so you indirectly infer their impact on the environment. And the Event Horizon Telescope image is really as close as we can ever get to kind of directly sort of imaging them, as it were. And so you get closer and closer, but with black holes there's a fundamental limit. You can't go any closer than this, but we do learn a lot. We've learned a hell of a lot compared to even when I started my PhD, but much more remains unknown. So for example, we still don't know, although I've told you that black holes can be end states of stars, we still don't know the assembly history of the black hole in the center of the Milky Way galaxy. We don't know how it assembled, like what was the seed black hole, how big was it? We don't know, and those are sort of open questions.
Well, you've also talked about the role of the imagination for science, and just now in your opening, but also in your book. And I'm curious then, so how do you form your next hypothesis? What are the questions that are leading for you in your mind today? And event-based, I imagine, evidence-based, but what's next?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, every scientist has a particular style, and it's like every artist, they have their own take. So I'll share my personal process. And so I think for me, what is the most creative part comes from building these conceptual models. So you start out, you're trained in science to basically pare down everything, right? And that's where the intuition and experience come in. Okay, what is essential in a model? Because it's very complex. You have to simplify it in order to grab onto it to understand. So you build first a very simplified model where you have made a judgment on what you think is the gist. And so, hopefully you've captured, what is really important. once you understand that simple system, then you quietly sort of quickly add, one element after another of complexity, bells and whistles. So it's all in conceptualizing and visualizing the model, and then using sort of the abstract language of mathematics in which you sort of have facility to then use that as a tool to kind of probe better, to refine your model. So I think for me, a lot of the work is model building, conceptual model building, guided, as you said, by empirical data, by observational data, and computer simulation. So now we have these incredibly powerful calculation machines that can solve, sort of, they can give you huge amounts of insight because they have, they can solve sort of non-linear parts of a problem, the complex interplay between factors that we cannot actually figure out ourselves. So I think it's a combination. So the conceptual models for me are the jumping off point. And then, guided by observational data and simulations, then you take the next leap forward. So it's very calculated, but it's speculative. That's my style. And of course, there are astronomers who are much more engaged in the obtaining of the data, and simulators who actually are working on the latest codes, getting the fastest machines, the best visualization schemes, and so on. So I see myself as a synthesizer because, I like storylines, as I said before, like I like the grand narrative, as it were. Even if it's not that grand, it starts out being quite small and then you build the grandeur, right? So, but I love to be in that position. That's where I am in the work that I do, both on black holes and on dark matter.
Priya, I think you are also very interested in do a lot of work with how do we understand science. You do a lot of work about philosophy of science, historical philosophy of science. So we are very interested to ask you, how do these new ways of understanding the universe, for example, this play of opposites between light and dark, thinking about your work with dark matter, which is literally at the heart of the investigations underway into the nature of black holes, dark matter, etc., cause us to rethink certain established notions of knowledge.
Yeah.
So what do you think these changes culturally, like on our new mindsets and epistemologies?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, Gabby. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but it's a very profound question, of course. I think I am personally very interested in the history of ideas because I really want to know, as this person who's a synthesizer, right? It's very deeply informative to understand how the first simplest notions, even if they were incorrect and superseded, which always happens in science, they are informative. They actually tell you how people have been thinking from different vantage points. And the goal for someone like me, and I think for a lot of scientists nowadays who really think about their practice. I mean, there are some who don't think as much, but some of us who are constantly thinking about the practice as well as we are engaged in it, is to see the power of different vantage points. So for example, one of the things you can do, right, is that if you want to map a terrain, right, so a cartographic terrain. So, suppose I want to map, Puebla, the region, and Tonantzintla, and, all the volcanoes, and I want to map that part, right? Then I can choose to a vantage point where basically I have an aerial view, and then I just chart a contour map, a cartographic map telling you how high everything is, right? And then, so that's one way of perceiving the knowledge, presenting the knowledge, progressing with the knowledge. Another way would be people who live there and who have seen, for example, who map the terrain with trees. They know which tree grows where. And so that comes from a very different kind of cumulative knowledge, experiential knowledge in this particular example, for example, right? And so, but that's an equally valid point of view. And I think this is where we need to be much more epistemologically open. And, you get a much richer view of the terrain. So ideally what you want to do is you want to put the elevation and the trees and the animals, all the other perspectives. And I think in a lot of ways in Western science, we have kind of fixated on mapping the elevations, and we're not as open to trying to understand many other vantage points. And I think that is partly historical of the development of how the epistemology development and the dominance of that epistemology. So I think we have a lot to learn from different ways of looking at it. And even among scientists, right, I urge all my colleagues always to be open-minded, to be as open-minded as possible. I mean, we have the privilege that we are trained to be open-minded, and we still are not, huh? So we are not very open to radical new ideas. But yeah, I mean, and this is where, people often ask me, this is where sort of, I think, what is the role of indigenous knowledge? People ask me that, indigenous epistemologies, right, they're not correct, they don't have the right science. That's fine, because that is not always the meter by which we judge knowledge. As I said, for mapping this terrain, going back to that example, the picture that you make of that landscape is much richer. And in fact, without putting the trees together, it's actually deficit. It's a deficit if you're focused only on the elevations, right? So I don't know, I want to move to a more sort of syncretic ways of knowing. And I think this is important because, this is also a way to intellectually bring in more voices that were not part of the conversation, that are not part of the understanding of how knowledge is created. And there's now a lot more awareness of diversity of all kinds. And I think this intellectual diversity, which comes with cultural diversity, it comes with all the other kinds of diversity we want. I think that's what is really important. So your question, I don't have the answers, but all I can say is that many of us are trying our best to be open-minded and to cull and, to kind of digest what is rich and valuable about other ways of seeing. And and within science, it also has to do with new tools and techniques. So I talked about the cultural ways of knowing, but even science, there are many technically different ways of knowing as well. And so being open to those, and applying tools that you learn in some other problem in this problem, that kind of cross transfer of knowledge is also kind of really important. And I think, computation particularly has had a huge role to play in revealing that there's a new vantage point.
Yes. Oh, that was such a beautiful and hopeful answer. Thank you, Priya.
Thank you, Gabby. But that was a hard question. How you put me in that spot?
I'm sure she has more. I'm going to take the liberty of asking you one more myself before we bring in the writers. And that is just, it's exhilarating to think of you perched where you are and so avidly in pursuit of this syncretic, bigger story. And you really embody it in your work and in the way you describe your work. If you had to throw out perhaps a couple of questions that linger for you as an explorer of the cosmos, I know from reading you that one you've mentioned you feel will soon be resolved is whether or not we are alone in the universe. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah. So I think, there are many, many big questions that have preoccupied us as humans for a very long time that have lingered. Science has attempted to answer many of them and has very successfully tackled many of them. I think for me personally, I mean, aside from, when I say personally, obviously, I'm very invested in black holes and dark matter. So if the nature of dark matter were to be revealed and the particle was found, I would be thrilled beyond belief. And if the, two supermassive black holes colliding in the universe, if the gravitational waves from those were detected, we've detected the gravitational waves from their tiny cousin, little black holes colliding. I would like the big behemoths, I would like that to happen in my lifetime. that aside, sweeping that aside, I think the big sort of fundamental questions that have occupied humans always are we alone? And I think that, it is very clear now that, we moved from a way, a human point of view, human-centered point of view. We thought the solar system was the only, that was our universe. And only 100 years ago, we realized there were other galaxies, right? And now we have realized that not only are there other galaxies, but there are other solar systems, other systems of planets around stars. And in fact, the number of planets in the universe might outnumber stars even, because there are stars that have multiple planets, like our own solar system, right? So in terms of just numbers, just went up. The number of planets far exceeds the number of stars, most likely, which means the possibility of some kind of life, even if it randomly evolved on Earth, and we don't quite understand how and why and so on, the probabilities just went through the roof now, right? There's so many possible places where life as we know it. But one of the things I always caution my friends who are working on astrobiology and exoplanets is that, but how this is totally exciting and this is what we are hoping, right? But we shouldn't be fixated. We should be aware that we have our own conception of what constitutes life, carbon based. And so when we look for signatures of life, we absolutely have to be super open-minded, because I think even Stephen Jay Gould, who is a very famous evolutionary biologist, pointed out that even if you turn back the tape of evolution on our planet, and then you ran it again, it may not end up with us, because there's a lot of random events that have happened to create us in the end, the unpredictable. So there is, in the chemistry of life, the biology of life, at least as we've known it, it has unfolded with a lot of randomness in it. There's order, but there's a lot of randomness as well. So the predictability, so extrapolating just from us to every other possible life form, we should be aware of this. My own favorite, right? I mean, like I'm obsessed with this, so I might as well get it out. So when I was a young person, I read this book called Lumen. It's a book from, it's an old French book by Flammarion. And in that, there are sentient plants. I also confess, I love plants. And I think if you could see my house, there's tons of plants everywhere. And I talk to them, et cetera. So I'm quite crazy about them. So there is this idea that there are sentient plants. And, I love that. I love the idea. Why not, right? So I think that is one of the other big questions. Of course, there are other questions that have facets that are not entirely scientific, deterministic. And those are the big questions we've always had. Why are we here? Why are we here? Not how are we here? We sort of know how we got here with the Big Bang and the unfolding, but why? I don't know. Right now, it seems a sort of a sad situation. We seem to be here just so that we can destroy the Earth very well. But anyway, so I think, there are many big open questions.
Yes, right. And I think fiction have done a lot of work trying to answer those questions, especially speculative fiction. So Magda?
All right, we're going to bring in now our three novelists to continue speculating and to share with Priya also in the conversation, sort of what is that hinge between science fiction, speculation, speculative fiction. And I want to just remind anyone who's arrived late, we've asked the audience to please keep your audio and video off until we open for questions at the end, and the questions can be for any of the four presenters. I also want to say, well, it's an apology, I should say it in Spanish. Este evento realmente es enteramente en español, digo en inglés, y lo sentimos, ya lo habíamos dicho antes, pero la verdad es esto nos permite alcanzar un público mayor, pero no sin respeto a los hispanohablantes. And we're very grateful to Alberto for being willing to undergo this kind of conversation in English, which he speaks beautifully, by the way. So I'll try to be brief with the introductions because I want to give our speakers the most possible time. This means that I've condensed their extraordinary output and achievements into little capsules, and there's much more information on our website, and you can also Google them. I'm sure you will, because you're going to end up fascinated, and track them down, and by all means buy their books, especially from independent booksellers. So in alphabetical order, Alberto Chimal is a prolific novelist, short story writer, and essayist. Thank you for waving, that's good. He's known as one of Mexico's pioneers of experimental and online narrative. He also runs a YouTube channel and dialogue with his wife, Raquel Castro, also a writer, and has a steady, very ironic and droll presence in the Twitter sphere in Mexico, or in Spanish. His novels appear roughly every other year. I'm just extrapolating that, alternating with collections of short stories. Alberto Chimal lives in Mexico City, and he's returning to Under the Volcano this season as one of our masterclass teachers, leading the masterclass in Spanish in fiction, creación literaria en español. Victor Laval is the author of 7 works of fiction. It's hard to believe I am going to say this aloud. He was my student years ago at Columbia. And among his books that I have personally devoured are the novella, The Ballad of Black Tom, and The Changeling, and also one comic book. I think there's a lot more, but he's modest in his offering of biographical details. He joined Under the Volcano last year in Tepoztlan along with his wife, Emily Rabateau, and offered a special one-off class called How to Write a Page Turner, which I can assure you he knows how to do. Victor teaches writing at Columbia University and lives in New York City with Emily Rabateau and their 2 children. Welcome back, Victor. And our third writer panelist is Annalie Newitz, who inhabits multiple worlds. As a former fellow of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT, which we'll be hearing from later in the week, they continue to offer science as a fact-based journalist, but have also recently made the leap into science fiction. They're the author of the just published book, nonfiction book, 4 Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, and the novels, The Future of Another Timeline, and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. They're also the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. So welcome all of you, and what we're going to do again here is Gabby and I will alternate with some questions that any of you are invited to answer, and hopefully you can interrogate one another as well. So we start with one that I think is on the tip of all of our tongues. So what is the deal? What's the lure? What's the attraction of the unknown for writers in general, but especially writers of fiction, who by definition anyway create imaginary worlds? It's known as world building in the trade, but perhaps even more so for writers of science fiction and what we call speculative fiction. What is so cool about that precipice that goes into the unknown or the invisible, or maybe even the unthinkable, where you have all trod? Anybody?
You're so polite. Alberto, yes.
Yeah, raise your hand. Good idea.
Yeah, you can raise your hands, actually.
Yeah, Alberto.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Hello, everyone. It's really cool to be here talking with all of you. I don't know what Annalie or Victor may say, but I think that's one of the main lures, one of the big pulls of that notion is the fact that in our own everyday lives, we are always exposed to the possibility of the unknown in our own experiences. Sooner or later, we will have to ask ourselves those big questions Priya was talking about earlier. Who we are, why are we here? Maybe not in the great cosmic sense, but certainly in a little more intimate sense. Why am I alive? Why that person died? What happens next? Does anything happen next? What's the reason that the the facts of my life are like that? Why have I ended up in this position? All those questions have their origins in our everyday experience, but go beyond it and point to that which may not ever know about ourselves, about the universe, about causes and effects, about chance. So I think we can represent those questions and those anxieties, and also those attractions in our fiction, and mirror a very human, a very profound experience.
Annalie.
I'm raising my hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Alberto is saying. And I guess I'll answer by telling a very brief tale of my first encounter with the unknown. So certainly as a kid, of course, like any normal person, I was obsessed with black holes and with the universe. But that, I think when I was a kid, it just seemed like the known unknown. And so my first true look at the unknown was when I was a young adult. And I was talking to a friend of mine who is a very strict philosophical Marxist. And I had never encountered those kinds of ideas before. And he said, well, think about something that you don't know that's around you every day. He's like, picked up a coffee cup. And he's like, who made this coffee cup? Where did it come from? What are all of the social relationships that went into manufacturing this cup and bringing it here to you in Berkeley, California? And the coffee inside of it, where'd that come from? What were the social relationships that led to that? What were the historical relationships that led to the places that grow coffee? Why do some places grow coffee and some places buy coffee? And it frickin' blew my mind. And what it was realizing how much the complexity of social relationships, political and economic relationships had been shielded from my eyes and had been deliberately blocked from my comprehension. You know, that there were actually forces that were trying to kind of hide these relationships, you know, for good reason, right? Corporations don't want you to know the conditions in their company where they're manufacturing cups and growing coffee. And so from that point, I think a lot of my writing and a lot of my fiction is kind of about trying to rebuild that understanding and to try to give the reader what is ultimately a kind of fantasy of understanding how those social relationships fit together and how an individual's life fits into this dramatic historical narrative, which actually starts with the Big Bang, of course. It starts with physical reality, and then it kind of goes into this messy complexity of social reality that Alberto was talking about. And so I think, not for everyone, but I think for some fiction writers, that's really the pleasure and the kind of what draws us in is that hope that one day we could pull back the curtain and kind of show readers and show audiences, actually, this is how it all fits together. And guess what? It's actually kind of fucked up. And maybe we should do something. We should imagine how characters could move through the world in a way that might repair some of the damage and also might draw connections between people that were visible and that maybe were healthier than the ones that we have. But, you know, I'm a very utopian writer sometimes, so that's my way of doing it. I bet Victor would have a very different take on how to explore that question.
Well, I mean, first, I'm just as honored to be here as anyone else has said, and love those answers. You know, strange way, I think the thing I would throw in as to like why, in particular, let's say speculative fiction, or how I think of it as an adult, as a writer, I would think about our two kids. So as Magda said, we have two children. They're 8 and 10, and or 8 and 9, about to be 10. And something that regularly happens with the two of them is our older son will regularly still say like, today I'm going to be a dragon. And then our younger son is obsessed with animals and really is learning a lot about them. And depending on the day, he will be a dog or a meerkat or a bat or whatever it is. And I think when they were younger and they played that way, there was a part of me that they just thought, oh, this is fun to imagine, right? But with time, what I understand now is they aren't pretending. For that day, our older son is a dragon. And for that day, our younger son is a dog or a bat, or for that hour, for that 20 minutes, whatever it might be. And I think of them as, in a way, like doing this miraculous act of imagining themselves into another body, into another being, and then becoming that being. That second part of it is the part that truly feels like magic to me. And so speculative fiction, I think, is the closest as an adult that I can come to the kind of magic that our kids pull off like daily, you know? And that if I do the job well, then a person reading that book will find themselves transformed and becoming the people in that book, or the creatures in that book, or the monster in the book, and believing for a little while that they are that too, and that perhaps you come out the other end changed, sort of in the way that both Annalie and Alberto are talking about, changed by the ways that you were forced to think differently about the world, about the great questions of the world, and about how, as Priya was saying, like, and just literally like how all this exists, you know? So that would be my answers. Why?
I love that you've brought in the element of play, because I find reading your books, all of you actually, all three of you, there's a liberty and almost a daredevil quality to levitating into these different imagined worlds in which, I mean, Victor, you have the title itself, The Changeling, you know, telegraphs that idea of transformation. It's not always a pleasurable transformation. It can be scary transformation. You bring us back to a more hopeful world, though, at the end, I think in every case. But so what about works next, works in progress? Are you following
Magda.
science?
I wanted to ask them about that particular thing Annalie and Victor were telling about, that was being or imagining another way to be. I think this is, there's this kind of confusion about what speculative fiction is nowadays, because there's this notion that our current reality looks like a dystopian or apocalyptic movie or novel, and therefore that science fiction is the new realism. But I think that's not the intention of this kind of narratives. As you were saying, the intention is to be distanced from reality so we can analyze it and be careful about it. So what would you say is the role of language and imagination on the representation of realities that are not mirrored in our world, especially like Priya was saying, in a time that we are dangerously close to a point of no return, to the singularity and the event horizons point of messing it all up in nature. So what do you think?
The climate catastrophe?
Yes. What do you think about that? The role of language and imagination in this particular historical moment.
Well, I will say, I do have some friends. I mean, the idea of the writing needing to mirror the reality of the time. I have a few friends who are writing work this year, and one of the kind of running jokes that started to become was the ones who are writing about the world as it is now, they just kept saying like, I waited a month too long to turn this book in. Like, things got worse. Things got so much stranger than I could have guessed, you know? And so, at least to my mind, if anything, I'm often amazed that the realists don't pull their hair out. Because I just feel like, how can you keep up with this stuff? I can go off in a world where there's trolls who steal babies. That's timeless, you know? But this stuff, reality, woof, I don't know how you keep up.
And there's a lot of trolls stealing babies in real life,
You're
too.
right. You're right about that.
You're
right.
keeping up with the times.
True, true.
Yeah, I actually think there's an overlap between certain kinds of political policies and science fiction writing and fantasy writing. And I think here in the United States, this idea of a Green New Deal is a kind of piece of science fiction. And I don't mean that in a negative way, like that means it'll never happen, because I actually think pieces of it are going to come to pass in some form. But I think what we really do as imaginative thinkers is inspire people who are trying to make, public policy, who are trying to do science. We're part of the scientific project, and that's about thinking through ways that we can approach the world differently. And I think without that, it would be a lot harder to make better legislation around how to protect the environment.
I mean, I just want to quickly add that I think, all three of you from your work, and, and a lot of writers who are doing speculative fiction, it's very clear that we are at a moment in time that, we want to transform. We are not happy with the status quo, and that it's reaching a sort of, a climactic, it's becoming untenable. Physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, the world is too messy, it's too unfair, it's too unequitable, and this is not acceptable. So at least I think we have this growing consensus, and I think you are all contributing in a major way to this realization, because that's what prompts you to present what you do with your imagination, other possibilities, new possibilities of how to transform this world. And as Annalie mentioned, and they may translate into practical, or as Victor mentioned, ways of imagining how to be something different. And I think just being made aware of these possibilities and accepting that the current status quo is unacceptable, I think is extremely invaluable, because otherwise we'll just have no change if that doesn't happen, right? And so it's a moment, in a way, I see all of your work contributing to this great moment of reflection and introspection of everything that we've created. And also connecting this sort of this physical outer world with the inner world that we have created. There's the physical universe that has come to be, that we happen to find ourselves in, but then there's a world that we are creating, that we have been implicated in messing up.
Yes.
Yes,
I
that's
wanted
right.
to go back to Gabi's comment, because I think it opens up something pretty fascinating, if I understood you right. And you almost seem to me to be suggesting that quote unquote reality is now so akin to dystopia that the worlds of fiction, and particularly speculative fiction, open the possibility of generating a kind of utopian vision.
Alberto, you were about to say something.
Yeah, thinking about what Magda has said, I think the danger for many of us, which lies in thinking about the present in dystopian terms, to just say we're living in a dystopia, is that we may be less inclined to think about solutions to our problems, to think about alternatives. Many times, the dystopian fiction is presented as some kind of inescapable situation, something like a black hole of action, of social change and transformation. And this makes, of course, for some greatly depressing movies such as Soylent Green or whatever, but it doesn't do much for us to imagine alternatives to that, solutions to that. And maybe something we can do as fiction writers is also to push back against these abysmal ideas, this shutting down of our own thinking about alternatives. And maybe we can do that in many ways, simply embracing rather than rejecting what we are discovering about our own behavior regarding nature, about our own perspectives regarding the universe, the cosmos, and of course, the Earth's ecosystems, the many ways in which social institutions and communities interact with each other. For example, here in Mexico and in many places in the so-called global South, we have faced the fact that most of traditional speculative fiction doesn't include us at all. So the future is always the future of the global North. So we have had to write ourselves into the future and to project our own ideas and possibilities about the future in fiction that doesn't exist anywhere else. So that's an ongoing process, an ongoing conversation amongst readers, writers, everyone. And I think it's an important one because many times in recent history, we have seen this defeatist worldview in our countries, like everything's bad, everything's been always bad, everything will always be bad. So that's not the way we can enact any kind of change. So we need to change that attitude to begin with.
I love
writing ourselves in. It seems so powerful. It's a life project.
Yeah.
I would imagine all of you have that sense as you move along book to book.
I think beautifully put, Alberto. I think that, in the past, we all represent some corner that was written out of the past, and that we're no longer willing to be silent witnesses. And I think that's so beautifully put.
Thank you.
So this is a question for everyone again, inviting you again to share with us, what do you let yourself imagine now, based on what we know in science, in evidence, but also in the present, in our different epistemologies, as we were saying, from our situated knowledge, as Donna Haraway puts it, our own way of look at reality from our different locations. But also, what do you allow to let yourself imagine, more interestingly, based on what we don't know? What do you allow to be crazy about the future? I love the faces like looking.
Okay, I will take the bait, and I'll share a little bit of one of the things that I'm thinking about. I'm not going to claim to have made progress yet. So one of the things that has always interested me is the way in which experiential knowledge gets written out in science, and sort of this integration of experiential knowledge somehow, and how to do that. I mean, this is like, it's a meta big question. Nobody has the answer, but I think people have feared even thinking about it because of the possible blind alleys that could take you in. But I think there are some, quantum mechanics has showed us. So, science is predicated largely by the fact that you have an observer who is making measurements, experiments, whatever, and then you have something that's observed, and that there's a separation between the observed and the observer. And quantum mechanics, that's why it's so crazy. It disrupted that tidy separation. And the act of observing changes the system, and so we are grappling with that. But to me, what the quantum mechanics really tells you, like at a profound level, is that there is a way in which experiential knowledge needs to be integrated with other forms of knowledge. And I think for me, personal journey-wise, intellectual journey-wise, this is a question that I would love to tackle and make some inroads in. And it's pretty radical. I think a lot of scientists would say, "Oh my God," I'm really, that's why I want to foreground it in the quantum mechanics example. I am not talking about things like whether praying will make your cancer go away. I mean, I'm not talking about those kinds of things. I'm talking about something different. But I think this is a challenge, because I think I've always felt that science, powerful as it is, still misses things, and I'm always looking to see, what it could be missing. And one obvious thing, as I mentioned above, is the indigenous epistemologies, other ways of knowing and being with nature, other ways of observing nature that do not require dominating nature, that require coexisting with nature. That's my trees example. And so, for me, I would feel very thrilled if by the end of my life, I have made a little bit of progress on this question.
Priya, I think that's so great and so important. And I think that one of the things I think about a lot in my fiction is, how do you imagine structure without domination? And that's like something, I think, especially for people in the United States, that's just almost impossible to imagine. It's just not how we're trained in school. In school, we're sort of taught like the guy who's on top is the guy who's right. And that's kind of, the way the schoolyard works, and that's the way the government works. And obviously that's not a good sustainable system. And so I think, like, in terms of Gabby's question, I think the thing that I allow myself to imagine, particularly in a novel that I'm writing right now, is first of all, that humanity does survive. Which is, in a weird way, like a super radical idea, like the idea that we even make it past this particular inflection point. I mean, we've had other inflection points historically, and I think we will survive. I don't think it's going to be easy or fun. I think it's actually going to be incredibly horrible for many generations. But I think that when we come out on the other side, however long that is, maybe that's 20,000 years, maybe that's 50,000 years, that we have a really radically different relationship with what we call the natural world. And that maybe we even change our idea of what it means to be natural, or what nature is. Because of course we're part of nature, which we always try to pretend isn't true. We're all animals, and we poop and we do all the stuff the animals do. And I think, in a way, kind of getting back to what Alberto was saying about kind of pushing back against this nihilism in a lot of speculative fiction, just saying, like, look, we're going to screw up, we're going to make it through, we're going to come up with new models for understanding our relationship to nature and each other. Those models will also suck, and we will have to come up with another set of models, and we will keep iterating, just as we learn from the scientific process, that it's a process of iteration. You learn more, you try again, and I just want people to try again. Like, that's, like, in a weird way, my whole goal as a writer is just to get the reader to come into a world where they're like, okay, I have enough emotional and intellectual fuel to try again, and to believe that humanity can try again, and humanity and all of our other friends that we might make along the way, plants and, whales and elephants and all the other creatures that we might want to hang out with. And I think, yeah, that's what I dare to think about when I'm allowing myself to be hopeful.
You know, my wife is in the last few years has become a really, if I can say, like a really excellent environmental writer, and has been, as a result, I've been sort of learning alongside her, you know, all the things that she's gathering and reading and then writing about. And in particular, she's writing about from the local level. We live in Washington Heights in New York City. It's an area where there's a lot of sort of the environmental damage that hits the poor first, hits here. And so, you know, heightened levels of asthma, well outside of anything else, that kind of thing. But the sorry, something popped up for a second. But what one of the things that she also has taught me, and that I put a lot of hope in, or faith in, is that she also is constantly introducing me to all the young people around the world doing astounding work to bring attention, in particular, to the local concerns that they have, right? And her showing me again, like the idea, she often makes the distinction between the sort of older idea of what environmentalism is, which, to speak broadly, is a white guy went to this place, he stayed there for a little while, he wrote a book about it, and everybody came to him to say, well, how do we fix the world? And her saying, like, and that had its power and its beauty, and it has its place in the history of this movement. But she said, but the new wave of it, to Alberto's point earlier, is all these young people in particular, obviously lots of people, but she's focusing on like teenagers and stuff, who are just saying, in my little town, my little part of the world, we can't, this kind of water, we're having problems with water like this. This particular plant or fruit that grows here is like this. And the beauty of the internet age allows them to talk to each other and to spread that message, so that you start to get this picture of the earth, not from up here where there's one person saying, I've studied everything and here's all the answers, but all the people down here saying, these are the, you know, what do you call it? Like, these are all the nerves together, and we put them together and you get a picture of the body as a whole. And I take great sort of inspiration and admiration from all those local activists who are so young and so bold, and I just adore them, and they give me a lot of hope.
I want
That's
to
great.
open the floor to questions if you all don't
Alberto
mind.
was about to answer
Yeah.
the
Just a little bit. That's what Victor said was great, and I just like to add that all this we've been talking about can also mean, if one is at least a little bit optimistic about it, we can also get to the point where we can think of history itself in another way, like using another models, using another narratives, another plot summaries for history. Maybe we can leave behind the idea that history is always the story of somebody conquering a territory, somebody colonizing a territory, some exalted white guy leading everyone else to do something. There are many other ways in which we can understand history, understand the way human communities evolve and relate in different ways to their environment. And maybe we can point at least to some of those ways in our writing. And I think that's really exciting.
Thank you for that. It's extremely exciting. And one of the threads that's emerged from all of you, and starting with Priya, is the notion of the desperate need we have for multiple points of view. And it strikes me that, of course, this is one of the great tools of fiction, is points of view. And we almost don't have the language for that yet globally. Some kind of, texture, some medium, like the space-time fabric itself, that allows for the expression
Right.
of this vast web of knowledge that would let us see the trees or the storefronts in Washington Heights, or different understandings. And the questions that I'm seeing here in the chat, I would just like, if you don't mind, to turn to a few of them, because they seem to focus on those thoughts and where that might lead.
Yeah, so Magda, just one quick comment. So I was recently at a conference held at MIT called Unfolding Intelligence. And this was a place that we visited as well. And, we noted that there is this tension between this in our frameworks where we want a universal description and between the multiplicity. So, and I was trying to promote this idea of what we need are what are called interglots in linguistics, right? These are things that borrow from many other traditions. So there it's in the context of a language, but it can be framework, it can be a conceptual framework, something that, incorporates and in a cooperative way, but selectively picks and comes up with something. Because I think this framing in terms of looking for universals will bring us back into the same kind of traps of,
Yes.
dominance and hierarchy and all of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, someone has asked whether you think there could possibly be some form of consciousness inside a black hole. So talk about points of view.
Talk about the documentary movie Interstellar.
Up there?
I have to say, I did love Interstellar, and the thing I liked least about it was the supposedly emotional human part of the story.
Same.
Still feeling like daddy problems or whatever.
Yeah. Totally.
I think it was the least well-developed part of the story. I'm not saying that, daddy problems are not interesting. They are, but Interstellar, it didn't manifest well.
Yes.
But, I think consciousness, I don't know, it's the big C. I have no idea. It's a very big question. And, what happens inside a black hole in terms of what happens to information and so on. I don't know. I don't know anything about agency or whatever, but we're talking about like the physical fate of things that go into a black hole. What happens to the memory of what went into the black hole? We are only at the stage where we think we may be able to understand. We may have settled the question that there isn't complete information loss, that information is stored in some way that we don't know. And we also don't know how to disentangle how it's, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to leave room for others to speak, but there's a quick analogy that works that Hawking came up with. So if you have an Encyclopedia Britannica and you look up, I don't know, New Delhi, India, which is where I'm from, and it has all the details on it, you put it in a box, you burn it down, and you keep all the ashes in the box. Obviously, all the details about New Delhi, India are in there. We just no longer know how to extract it because it's no longer in a form that we recognize, paper, ink, print. So the information is there. We don't know how to extract it. We also don't know how it's stored in the ashes, right? So I think that's a nice sort of analogy of where we are at with black holes at the moment. We know that.
Wow. There's a very interesting comment from Nelly Rosario. Hello, Nelly.
Hola, Nelly.
Fantastic writer also. She says, science calls them practitioners or inventors, usually reserved for experiential scientists of color. So thinking about this change of language, I think, what do you think about these denominations within fiction, not only like in the hierarchies of science, on science writing, as Priya was saying, but also in fiction, we have our own systems of preserving reality even in that imaginative worlds. So what do you think about this possibility of rename or reframe that kind of language? Alberto, you want to say that something, right?
No, but I can say that.
I thought you were like...
No, that's fine. I think we at least have a great opportunity to do that exactly with our fiction, and also in a ways that we relate to sciences and other disciplines through our fiction, because something that's realist or naturalistic representation sometimes, many times, leaves out of their stories is the idea that things can change. Sometimes the way in which something is represented as being faithful to some previously decided upon reality seems enough, and we have seen it many times here in literature here in Mexico, for example. The idea that something that is like aggressive and violent and depressing about the criminal violence or whatever is enough for a book if it presents it faithfully, and even if it doesn't offer any suggestions, solutions, or alternatives, that's fine, because it's true to life, so to speak. But life is also life can contain also the possibility of imagining change, of trying to push back against established hierarchies and terminologies and typologies, and inventing new ones and adapting our understanding of the world according to the way we transform language to understand the world. So that's really important, and that's something that can be very easily made in fiction, because we can, create counterfactual worlds, counterfactual narratives, and in those frameworks, we are allowed to think along those lines, and that's something our traditional realist storytellers can't do.
Annalie, Victor, do you
Yeah,
have
do
any
better than
thoughts?
that.
Yeah,
Was amazing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I was going to say, going to the question around, science writing, like realistic science writing, nonfiction. I think, obviously one of the ways to address this is to think about what I try to do in my science writing is to think about science in conversation with social science and the humanities. I think that the divisions between those areas are actually just a false distinction. And my most recent book is about archaeology, which is a field that is today radically interdisciplinary. It's scientists working right alongside people who are doing kind of the speculative work that humanities scholars have always done, thinking about how people engage with their environment and how people engage with each other, and how that led to all of these remains that we study using chemistry and physics. So I love that. And I love the idea of taking apart the edges of science and saying, like, look, science actually belongs in all these different places, but also, as Priya was saying, there's other ways of knowing that really should be centered within science, and that, we need to just stop getting so fussy about these kinds of boundaries. And then that, I think, opens the door a tiny bit to having other kinds of perspectives, and not just having this kind of European guy who's like crusade, wandering the landscape and telling us what to think. And that is very, that to me seems like the most productive way to kind of be gaining knowledge as we try to change the world and try to make things better for the majority of people.
I mean, and I just want to echo that, many of us scientists who are working at the cutting edge, it is very clear to us that the discoveries are going to come from these vertices, places where disciplinary boundaries are dissolving, and in the broadest way, because that's where the new ideas are going to come from, like the revolutionary ideas are going to come from. And in many fields, they are, many questions, they are in a place of stasis now, because they are stuck with the apparatus that they have, the languages that they have, they're limiting. So they've kind of stuck in terms of discoveries. And I think all the new discovery space is going to be open. I mean, there are many of us who are working on these kind of what may appear as totally esoteric, abstract questions, right? But, at the cutting edge, and we are all convinced that the breakthroughs in our fields, in our questions that don't seem to be obviously connected to the real world are going to come from the collision of other disciplines. And in the broadest sense, humanities, social sciences, creative arts, all kinds of disciplines. And I totally agree that these disciplinary boundaries are quite artificial, and they're an artifice of really all these systems that we've talked about historically.
It somehow, when you were all saying it brought me the image of Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer, and his trilogy, which begins with a book called The Genesis, where he writes hundreds of tiny capsules through which you can look at moments in time, and they're not even necessarily chronological, they're juxtaposed, and he describes kind of looking through a keyhole. And I think of Cortázar, reversing the flow of time in books like Hopscotch, Rayuela, and even thinking of Victor, who just jumps off a ledge and reverses time, goes back and forth in his novels. It seems that fiction is such a flexible, plastic, malleable medium in which to enact some of this kind of what we could call thinking. I mean, it's exploration, it's diversion, but it's also thinking aloud. It's a form of knowledge in a way. And I'm struck so much, Priya, by what you seem to be implying, which is that science itself, which we think of as so tethered to its machines and its, I don't even know the terms for them all, but the ways of looking and measuring can actually find new paradigms for its pursuit of these same questions. And this is a statement, it's not necessarily another question, and I don't want to take up the space of other questions.
No, but it's a beautiful, I think it's a beautiful reflection of all this. I want to address, synthesize two questions in one. They asking for advice to write ourselves in the future. And I mean it in a broad sense. How do we write ourselves in for people that are watching us and have perhaps scientific interests, or a lot of of our group that has writing and literary interests? How would you say it's an effective way, or maybe a strategy, to write ourselves in the future and in these possibilities of another worlds, another futures?
Well, excuse me, I would throw out there just to the point made earlier. I think one of the things that can take time to, or feels like a leap of courage in a certain way. So I grew up reading horror, right, and that's my first love as a form of literature. But and that's literature, and then also the movies and all the rest. But what I also knew, at least in the past, was like a person like me, like the joke was always like, well, if there was a Black person in the beginning of the horror movie, all right, we hit the 5-minute mark, we got to kill that one, because they're going to die first. So we shuffle them off the sort of screen, shuffle them off the book. Maybe they die in a very noble way so that nobody will say that we're prejudiced or something like that, but we get rid of them. And then we get down to all the characters who we really care about and watch them do whatever they're doing. And I remember at a certain point, so in my early writing life, when I was a teenager, I would write all these stories that were just white characters in horror stories, because I didn't understand it this way, but on some level I had come to believe it was impossible that there would be a Black character, a Black American character in a story, just doing whatever, I don't even mean like being the lead, like even a Black character who could just make it halfway through the story. And so it took a while for me, like I would say even, it wasn't until probably maybe college or even graduate school where I really said, okay, no, I'm going to write these stories I want to write, but I'm going to have a Black American character as the lead character. But even there was a trick, because what I found at first was I said that the character was a Black American. I mean, I said basically it was me. I'm not going to pretend. It was just me, right? But nothing changed about the rest of the story as a result. And so when I was looking at it, I would say, I don't know why, but I'm not convinced, right? And it was because it was a cosmetic change. All I had done was say he's this, and that's it. But then I started to say, like, well, when this body walks into the room, how is that different than another kind of body walking into a room? And it wasn't always negative. You know, oftentimes it was about the negativity of that in the US sort of system. But sometimes it was also, so I started to play with the idea like, well, if it was this Eastern European vampire, and then this Black American walks in, maybe he gets spared, because the vampire's like, you know, I've never had a conversation with someone like you before. This is my first time talking with a Black American. Why don't we just have a glass of wine? I'll go kill all the white people, but I'm gonna just talk with you. And I realized, like, oh, that's what it is. I genuinely imagine myself into the world, and then I think about all the ways that causes change throughout the story. And then that's how I begin to write myself in to the narratives. And then suddenly look back and I say, and then somebody kindly says, it was somewhat recognizable. It was a vampire tale, but it was also different, because I'm not used to seeing this kind of person moving through that world. And then when my character is having wine with the vampire and then sneaks out a wooden stake and kills him, and it turns out the best thing he could have been was a Black dude to beat the vampire, then suddenly it's a whole new kind of story, you know? And so I would just say that it was about understanding the ways I had sort of been trained to think it was impossible for me to be there. And then eventually realize how me being there enriched and changed everything about the story.
I mean, Victor, that was just absolutely wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, because I think even as people of color, you know, we are mired in those same tropes, and just breaking free out of them is challenging to write ourselves in. And this kind of, you know, points me to the quick comment I wanted to make about what can we do as scientists. I think the thing that it behooves us to do, celebrate Mexican scientists, celebrate our own. We are always looking to celebrating, you know, the big white guy who is at the big Ivy League, whatever. And I think we should celebrate our own. And we shouldn't always be buying into the hierarchies of, you know, I don't know, the Nobel Prize hierarchy or whatever. Yes, they are, you know, dedicated individuals who've done major work, they've done brilliant work, but, you know, increasingly it's not the work of one person, right? We all know that. And to have all these outdated prices that are fetting like 3 people when all the work is done by large groups, there are all these things that are, you know, let me just not go, I can go on and on about all these things. But, you know, I think that there's a way in which we should learn to, and it has to be learned, as Victor said, because we are in those tropes, we are stuck in that turnstile. We're going round and round those things. And I think the way to do that is to recognize our own, celebrate them, look historically for people who've contributed, who've been written out in our own cultures. And it also reminds me, you know, Victor's point also reminded me of what, you know, as feminist women were trying to do earlier, right? They were just transposing, they were just saying, okay, instead of like the white dude, we'll put the woman there, right? And that doesn't work. We see that then you don't get a movement that sustains. You get a movement that fractures, because again, it's not inclusive and whatever. So I just love the point that you made, Victor. I think it's very profound that even we have to, a lot of unlearning has to be done.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people about my recent book, For Lost Cities, is that they're so surprised that there are so many women in it, so many women who are working in the field and doing archaeology and doing lots of other kind of work around archaeology. And I hadn't thought about it because it's been, I mean, I've been writing about science and technology for like 20 years. And it's become a kind of ingrained reflex to always consult with women and people of color when I'm writing an article, just because that's something I've had to learn to do. It's such a male-dominated field. It's often very white.
But actually you do it very naturally now, I have to say.
I do it so naturally because and I remember learning it like sometime in the early 2000s and having people occasionally say to me like, how strange that your article had only women as sources. And it's like, well, most articles have only men as sources. So why is that strange? It's like, it's just, these are all experts. And so I think, I mean, to go to Victor's point about like what happens when you write people into the story, in a work of fiction, it works one way. I think in a work of nonfiction, what happens is you simply show the reader, yes, women and people of color can occupy positions of intellectual authority. They can be explaining the world to you. And that's just how it is. Like, they also explain the world to you just the way white men, they're explaining the world to you too. And so I think it's funny because people kept asking, well, how did that make it different to talk to women? And I honestly, because it had become such a reflex, I was like, I don't know that it actually did make it that different. It just makes it feel different to you, the reader, because there's these authoritative voices. But I don't think that the story I told about ancient history, I don't know that it was changed. I mean, how will I know? Because I can't do an experiment where I do the same book and I only talk to white dudes. Like, that probably would have been a really different book. But it's very, I just think it's, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I just think it's so important that it's not just about having characters who are, who are marginalized people, but also having authority figures and not authoritarian figures, but just having figures that we look up to and that we trust and that tell us about the world, and that we imbue them with the same kinds of trust that we do with a white male leader. And so that's kind of, I think to me, that's very, very important. And I'm glad it's become a reflex, but then occasionally I'm reminded that actually it's quite unusual, apparently.
We're all still learning. We need to retrain ourselves and be trained. But I do insist, I do believe from all of your work, as just one example before us, that when the voices change, the eye of the beholder changes, the texture of knowledge also changes. And the nature of what can be seen, by definition, becomes more manifold. And I'm longing for that way to inhabit multiple worlds more than we can already, and maybe in this kind of conversation have at least a look inside, what can often seem like an impenetrable silo, the silo of science, or the world in which really, really cutting edge science is happening, and which we have so little knowledge of. Priya. So I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I think we might have sorely tested our audience's staying power. I personally would be happy to go on for hours with you all. But I think we need to thank you so much for joining us. And you will be invited back. Believe me, you will be invited back. We're so grateful to all of you. And again, I want to encourage everyone to look up Priyamvada Natarajan, look up Alberto Chimal, look up Annalie Newitz and Victor Laval, read their books, buy their books. And don't forget to join us. You all have the link for the conversations that continue now every Wednesday, the rest of April, beginning this Wednesday, the 14th. And they're going to be great.
Well, thanks again for having us. It was really an honor to be here and
Thank you
chat
so
with you
much.
guys. You're all so awesome.
It's been great. Thank
It's
you
a real
so much.
honor, yes.
Oh, delighted to meet all of you. I hope we can all meet in real life and chat over a coffee or a drink. Much to learn from all of you. It's just fantastic.
Tepoztlan.
Yeah,
Tepoztlan.
Tepoztlan awaits you, please. We'll always have Tepoztlan, so so come.
All right,
Thank you very
everybody.
much. There's a lot of love in the chat, and there's a lot of questions and answers. So sorry, but we had limited amount of time. Thank you very much.
Yes, and we hope the questions will continue, people. We you know, many of you are now in the program, and you'll be talking, I know, in the next weeks about everything that emerged here. All right.
Gracias. Nos vemos
Adiós.
mañana.
Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas
Bye.
gracias.
Adiós, adiós.
Gracias.
Ay, muchas gracias por venir. Gracias,
Muchas gracias por
Alberto.
traernos.
Gracias,
Estuvo muy lindo.
Alberto. Qué bueno, que estuvo padre, ¿no?
Sí, 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 me gustó mucho. Además, qué bonito. Jamás pensé que íbamos a tener este panel así. Cuando vi la lista dije, órale, estuvo súper bueno.